Hello and welcome to Paint by Minis. My name's Adam, and in today's episode we're going to be painting a zombie. Now the technique that we're going to use is actually a really simple and easy technique. It's ideal for beginners or people that just want to batch out a bunch of zombies. So for today, the model we're going to use is actually a zombie from the Kings of War line by Mantic. I'm not a huge fan of the current sculpts by Games Workshop, so we're just going to use a proxy model for now. So one small hurdle that we have to get across is just changing up the bases. It's pretty easy though, and I'll show you how we do that later. So I'm not going to go through the whole cleanup process, but I just wanted to take a moment to show you how bad the flashing is in between the fingers on these models, so just take extra care. If you find that you do accidentally break a finger, don't worry too much about it. They're zombies after all, they can live without a finger. Another little tip in the build process is to actually use some fine grit sandpaper just to finish off the mould lines of the model. If you spend a little extra time, you can find that you can get a really smooth finish. Now the cleanup's complete, I'm going to go ahead and start the gluing process. It's going to be fairly standard with using poly cement, but I'm also going to use some plastic putty. For connecting the smaller parts of the miniature, all we really need is a small dab of glue. Now for the larger joins, such as connecting the figure to the base, I'm going to be using the plastic putty. The reason for this is that the putty can provide an extra bit of strength as it's a thicker, more coarse material. I'm also going to be using it to connect the torso to the legs, and the reason I'm using it in this instance is that there's actually a gap if you try and connect the two with just glue. The putty will provide a little bit of extra material to help disguise this. With assembly complete, we can move on to priming. Here in the UK, Halfords make a really good plastic primer. This is my personal favourite, but you can use whatever plastic primer you can get your hands on. With this model, all we're looking to do is get a nice white undercoat. Now we can start with painting. For the first step, we're going to use 50/50 Lahmian Medium and Reikland Flesh Shade. Now apply this colour all over the model's skin. Make sure to get into the recesses and try not to let it settle too much. If you do notice it pooling, just pick it out with the brush. Once you've got a nice even coat, make sure to leave this to dry fully before the next stage. Next, we're going to use 50/50% Lahmian Medium and Athonian Camo Shade. Again, we're going to apply all over the skin. Make sure to get a nice even coat. Now, the reason that we're using Lahmian Medium is because the shade, we're not really using it as a shade paint. We're using it more as a glaze over the skin. So to better control the glaze, we're thinning it and doing multiple layers. It's a similar concept if we're using normal acrylic paint. We would be watering that down and doing more layers opposed to one thick layer. It's the same concept here. Once we're done with the 2 layers of Athonian Camo Shade, that will be the skin finished. If you feel like it needs a final highlight, just drop in a bit of Pallid Witch Flesh or an off-white colour. But for now, we'll say the skin's complete. For the cloth on these miniatures, we're actually going to paint them using an acrylic ink. For me, I'm going to use Burnt Umber brown colour. You don't have to use the exact same one. In fact, you could even substitute this for a contrast paint. I would say just watch out if you're going to use inks, just make sure that it's a semi-opaque ink. If it's fully opaque or fully transparent, you'll find that it might have a slightly different finish. With these Daler Rowney inks, you'll find that transparents are marked with a T, semi with an S, and opaques with an O, so just make sure that it's an S. So just paint this on as you would any normal paint. It's a bit thinner and it has a tendency to run, so just make sure you control how much you have in the brush. We're going to go ahead and do 2 layers of this, so just make sure the first layer is fully dry before doing a second. So this is what it looks like after 1 layer. And this is it finished up with 2 layers. You'll notice that it's dried with a slight shine. This is just how this type of ink dries, and we'll fix this later with a matte varnish. And next up, we're going to use 50/50 Flesh Tearers Red and Lahmian Medium. Now this is a contrast paint, and we're going to be using this to paint in all the blood effects into all of the recess areas. Just take your time and work around the model. There's a fair few holes and punctures where this blood effect can go, but really it's up to you as to how much you want to apply to the model. Now to sell that this is blood a little bit better, we're going to go in with a second layer of the blood colour, and we're going to paint around the puncture wounds as well as into the wounds, and using our finger just dab away. This will leave almost like a smeared blood effect. So this is the model with the blood effects finished. It's up to you how much or how little you want to do of these blood effects, and it's actually a good idea to vary them between the models, otherwise they'll look a bit similar. So with the blood effects done, this model is actually finished. From here, we're going to move on to the basing. So to base the Mini, we're going to use Vallejo Earth Texture. This is my go-to product when doing any basing. It's a fine sand-like texture in some acrylic medium, normally with a dark paint as a base. In this case, this is Dark Earth. But to be honest, the colour doesn't really matter too much, as we're going to use some pigments to change the colour of the ground. When applying this texture paste, don't use a good brush, use an old synthetic brush. Using the earth texture, we're going to fill the gap between the pre-sculpted bases and the round bases. Using your brush, just apply a small amount. Don't forget you can let this dry and build it up in layers. It's probably best to do it this way rather than trying to gloop it all on at once. So now that the first layer has dried, we're going to go back in with a second layer of the texture paint and just fill up around the feet and level the base out. I'd recommend leaving this a good couple of hours in between coats, and especially at the end just to let it fully cure and dry. So as mentioned before, we're going to use some dry pigments to finish the base off. The ones I'm using here are made by Humbrol. They're a dark brown and a more greeny brown. I like to use 2 shades to get some good variation. One thing to know about pigments before we get started is that these are exactly that, pigments. There's no binder medium or anything like that, these are just straight pigments. This means when we apply them to the model, there's not actually going to be anything binding it and holding it to the model. Now you can apply these dry, straight from the pot, or you can mix them with a bit of water and apply them that way. There's pros and cons to both, but this time we're going to apply them wet. So starting with a little bit on my palette, I'm just going to go back and forth between water and pigment until I get a good consistency. If it's your first time working with the pigments, I'd recommend just doing a few tests. It's the best way to learn about these pigments is just to play around with them. There's so many applications for these pigments, and I'm sure we'll cover them in future videos. Now that the first dark brown pigment is dry, I'm going to go back in with the lighter green pigment. The great thing about these is that because they don't completely set, you can reactivate them with water. So here I'm just using a little bit of light green pigment, and then I'm going to go around the edges and just blend between the two. So once you're finished with the blend between the two colours, set the model aside and let it dry completely. Now that everything's dry, we're going to finally seal the model with some matte varnish. The varnish that I like to use is this Winsor & Newton varnish. It's actually meant to be used on canvases and paintings, but with a little bit of thinner, we can use this on our models nicely. I find that this provides a really nice ultra matte finish. When thinning anything to use in my airbrush, I like to use Vallejo airbrush thinner. You can use just water to thin if you want, but I find that this product works a little bit better and it allows a more smoother application of the paint, or in this case, varnish. I usually dilute the varnish to a ratio of 50-50, but if you're finding that the airbrush is struggling to pass it through, just dilute it a little further. The airbrush that I use is nothing fancy. I got this one off Amazon for about £15 and it's lasted me a good couple of years. As long as you take care of them and clean them out thoroughly after every use, you'll find some good mileage with these. So here we have the model after varnishing. You'll notice that the leather trousers that we painted with the acrylic inks have actually been matted down completely now, so they're no longer extremely shiny. Unfortunately, one of the side effects of using this varnish I find is that it creates a weird film over the pigments that we use. I've not been able to find any way to avoid this, but luckily for us we're going to finish with a wet looking ground, so it's not a problem for us. So to get the wet looking ground, we're going to go ahead and use Still Water by Vallejo. To apply this to the model, just get a little bit on your brush and dab it onto the ground. You don't need much at all to make the ground appear wet. You'll notice that the weird colouring caused by the varnish has completely disappeared. I also went ahead and applied this effect over the blood to make it look wet. Allow the water effects to dry completely, and then we're finished. And here they are, a horde of undead ready to do your evil bidding. This is a really fun and flexible technique, and you can mix up any of the skin tones or the cloth colours to really make your zombies stand out. I really hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. It's been a real fun video to make. I hope to see you again. Take care guys.